Welcome. I'm Sarah Hallerman. I'm a board member of IDA of Central Ohio and a parent member of OH Kid. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to participate in this coffee conversation today. Thank you so much for joining. We have two wonderful participants joining us today. Dr. David Brobeck's 47-year career as an Ohio educator began in the Kent City schools in 1975. There he taught reading and language arts and coached football and track 17 years. He was a middle school administrator for 8 years in Kent and Woodbridge and served as a superintendent in Salem City and field local between 2000 and 2010. Dr. Brobeck was a graduate school professor at Walsh University in North Canton, where he taught graduate courses in law and finance for more than a decade. His research focus included neuroscience applied to student learning, which paved the pathway to Walsh University's transformation to a science of reading university. Dr. Brobeck strives to motivate and inspire education stakeholders to implement evidence-based methods for teaching reading. He is currently employed as a research associate with the University of Cincinnati Systems Development and Improvement Center. Bouie currently serves as Executive Director of P5 Curriculum in Youngstown City School District. Aaron previously served as an assistant principal and principal. Aaron's interests include the role of relationships, collaboration, and creativity in making the shift to evidence-based methods for teaching reading. Aaron and David are both active members of P20 Literacy Collaborative, which brings together representatives from higher education, school districts, professional associations, regional entities, and ODE and ODHE to improve equitable access to high-quality literacy and instruction and literacy outcomes.
All right, so what I want to do to begin is just really review the three questions that were contained in the promotional email that we created related to this webinar, because that really will serve as our agenda for today. Our conversation will be framed around these three questions. The first one is, do children really learn to read in different ways? And then secondly, is multisensory structured literacy really an evidence-based best practice and method for intervention and remediation? And then finally, does the Ohio Dyslexia Guidebook recommend a specific curriculum? We encourage you to pose questions. What we're going to do is actually address those questions at the end. We are going to be monitoring them throughout, but we will address them at the end. I did want to clarify that we'll be answering questions really that connect to these three questions that frame our conversation today. So we're probably not going to get into very technical aspects of the guidebook, things of that nature, but really focus on these questions if possible. So don't hesitate to pose a question at any time. And if you don't see us answering, just know we have time that we are saving at the end to address these questions. So what I'd like to do, just focusing on the first question, I really want to begin by focusing on this topic of multisensory structured literacy. So it's really interesting that our law in Ohio combined the term multisensory with structured literacy. So what I'd like to do is just begin by inviting you to define these terms for us. Can you do so, and then just help us understand how they're addressed in the guidebook?
Sure. Let me take a first stab at this. The legislature, when they wrote the law, used the term multisensory, and they wanted it to be a multisensory structured literacy approach. But it's important to separate the two terms. Structured literacy is not synonymous with multisensory. Multisensory, I think if you talk to some of the experts in this area, they would probably use the term multimodal, that there's some different things that we can do with children. So this was addressed in several different ways, but in the guidebook, to make it simple, I did a word search on structured literacy, and it is not connected in the guidebook with multisensory. So when somebody asks me, what does multisensory mean? That means that you're using different modalities. Some people might be familiar with whole brain teaching, where you use gestures to help students retain information and remember things. We see that in athletics, coaches often will have athletes do different things in chants and movement and sort of things to help them remember. If you were ever in marching band, you used an 8 count to learn different parts of the movement. So those are types of things that are multisensory. We do know from the neuroscience that we learn with our entire body. So we aren't, human beings did not develop sitting and listening to lectures. We developed as nomads to walk around, to find food, to find shelter, to find water, to sustain life. And that was a long process, depending what your research says and how long human beings have been on the face of the earth. So we want to separate structured literacy from multisensory to understand that structured literacy is an explicit and systematic method of teaching children how to read. And that is defined very well in the guidebook. Actually, if you are out there and you have a copy, I think that's on page 11. I'm working from memory, but I think that's where you'll find it.
Thank you. That is so helpful. So let's go ahead and move into, I'd like to talk a little bit about the testimony. I know many of our viewers probably have been following along and logging in and watching the interesting conversations that have unfolded at this State Board of Education level, or you may have been watching the recordings after the fact. But if I understand correctly, our State Board of Education received testimony from an OSU professor who made an interesting claim that multisensory structured literacy is not evidence-based. Can you tell us a little bit about this testimony?
Well, actually, I did testify a month after the professor from a different institution did, in part because a former colleague from when I worked at Walsh University contacted me and said, I used to get this question a lot, you teach school law, right? And which is true, I did teach law and finance, and some of these things don't make sense. So I looked at it, and there was a cite in there from the Reading League Journal, and it didn't make sense to me. So I had, as a researcher, I wanted to look at, and having done research when I was at Walsh, primarily is where I did my presentations and publication, that what wasn't right here. And so what I did was I actually wrote to the author of the article, and she sent a letter. If I can screen share, I think I can bring that up. Let me make sure I have it in the right spot. Yeah, so let me do that. It'd be easier to show what the writers did. So I wrote this letter, and are we good? You can see it on the screen right now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yes.
So it was written, the authors of the two articles replied to me. And again, I'm not going to call out a colleague from a different institution, so I did redact the name here. But what's important is the people who wrote the article said the terms multisensory instruction and structured literacy are used synonymously in the memo submitted by this professor, when they are in fact two very different things. And that's what I said when you asked me earlier, that these are different. So multisensory is a term used by Orton Gillingham. And this particular study did take a look at that. And if it will let me, this is the study. The site was a combination of this paragraph in orange, but the sentence after it was omitted. And then the second part of the site was this sentence, and the sentence before it was omitted. Now that's critical, because as researchers, we have due diligence to tell the whole picture. Sometimes when you're researching, and I'm an action researcher means I test ideas in the place of work, we measure the results, collect the data, make an assumption. If it works, we continue to do it. If it doesn't work, we're happy, because we don't waste our time doing something that doesn't work. And then we move on. In this piece that was there, both Professor Elizabeth Stevens and Emily Solari did find that this multisensory approach didn't meet a statistical standard, but it had up here, this is the 0.32. They describe that as promising. So again, what we want to do is be able to make sure that we present evidence as it's clearly stated. Again, this letter is a public document. It was sent to the State Board of Education. My goal is not to call out any of my professional peers, but to beg the question, why omit certain parts of information? Because that affects a practitioner. in the school system like Mr. Bouie?
I was going to say, Sarah, taking a stab at that same question. One of the things when you speak about evidence, looking at the guidebook, reviewing the guidebook, it is very interesting because over 20 plus years, I've worked in multiple different urban school districts. So we know, historically speaking, urban school districts have a large number of scholars with high needs. So in essence, we get a lot of funding to help close those achievement gaps. So we spend a lot of Title I dollars on professional development. The interesting thing that I was just reflecting on during reading and reviewing the guidebook was almost every single thing and pretty much everything that is taught in the guidebook have been either professional developments that districts that I've worked for as a teacher or as an administrator have invested in to grow our capacity as educators, while at the same time, it's stuff that when I started becoming an administrator, those were the best practices that we were exposed to. I was finding as I was researching, trying to find what can we do to better equip our staff members to meet the needs of our ever-changing urban population and such. So that's the part of also testifying at a state board of education meeting regarding support for the guidebook myself. It was very interesting how the concept of evidence-based was questioned so aggressively when everything in the guidebook that I had encountered seemed to be consistent with all the research and professional development trainings I have either received and or advocated for on behalf of our scholars and our educators.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I believe that the letter that David referenced is actually a public record. And so we can share a link to that for people who are interested. And we really encourage people to form their own opinions. You know, the testimony is available, it's recorded, and the documents are available online. So, but this is so helpful. I do have another question, just in terms of people who have testified to the State Board of Education on this topic of the guidebook. Did our State Board of Education receive any testimony from anyone in the field of special education?
I'll speak to that one because I think it was on the same day that I happened to be testifying. There was a professor, I think it was a Dr. Terry Hessler, a professor from Ohio State University, that during the same thing shared and advocated on behalf of the fact of how important the guidebook will be to helping support scholars who are who need special ed services, who have been identified as in need of special ed services. And it was interesting. She spent a lot of time and got a lot of questions, a lot more than Dr. Brobeck and I received. She got a lot of questions about her recommendation for that. But she indeed was there. I mean, to be honest, you can go back and watch it. I think we testified on April 12th. So you can go back and watch the recording and see her, you know, her statement, Dr. Brobeck and myself, both of our statements on what we had done. And if I remember correctly, she even had, I think it was 5 other professors sign off and agree with her testimony. So I think just the 2 of us here are just a small number of the group who have actually advocated on behalf of special ed scholars, whether in writing or at board meetings as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, on that testimony, and I do want to say thank you to the 16 different institutions who saw a copy of my written testimony prior to my presentation, who agreed with what we're trying to say here about the neuroscience. And again, I want to come back to this. This is what's different. I learned and studied neuroscience and cognitive psychology. And I guess it's explained this way. I was a peer from a different institution complained that Dr. Hessler and I did not have doctorates in reading literacy. That is true. But I taught reading, and when I started working with students at the graduate level, and I wanted to understand this, when I started to study neuroscience, just a second, for example, in my research, this is one of the books I picked up. There's a chapter in here called The Reading Brain. The authors of that chapter are 4 professors, researchers from MIT. None of them are from the field of education. They are from the field of cognitive neuroscience. There are all these tests that read the pathways, and the early question was, do we read the same way? Well, that's a sort of a loaded question. The brain processes the look at print in the same way in all human beings. We have a systematic, explicit way of doing that. But, you know, as I listen to Dr. Hessler, what's important about what she had to say is special education ties to dyslexia. My personal story is I have a grandson who we understood early on that there was an issue. Coming out of nursery school, he could recognize 5 letters of the alphabet. And we fought to get him on an IEP to start kindergarten. That IEP carried, now he's in 3rd grade, but he's a top level reader because he received structured literacy support from his school. Critical for him to be able to do this. And I guess somebody said, well, what did some districts say? Why don't you let them grow out of it? Well, the fact is you don't grow out of it. It's the way his brain is wired. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just different. And I know some people think dyslexia is you see letters backwards. That is not factual. That's one thing that happened to some kids. But if speech delay could be a factor as well. But what Dr. Hessler brings into it is an expertise in special ed. That all ties together. We're not in opposite forms. And I also said when I testified, there is no reading war for neuroscientists. That ended when they had these machines that can actually read the brainwaves and tell you where they are. So I don't see it as a reading war. I know that the brain learns in a structured methodology, and this is what is good for kids. It's beneficial to all, and it doesn't hurt anybody. So what if a child's reading really well? Should they still have a phonetic background? Yes, because it will help with spelling. And as a person who didn't get phonics early on and doesn't spell and relies on spell check, yep, I agree with that one.
I was to add on to that, Dr. Brobeck, one of the things you said about the speech world. As I've learned and colleagues that I've worked alongside have learned, we've come to find out that our speech pathologists in buildings are some of our greatest resources when it comes to the foundational teaching of reading skills. And last time I checked, most speech pathologists are not trained as educators or studied specifically in reading, but through their study of linguistics, that we have taken their skill set and embedded into classrooms. And I mean, speech pathologists, if you have a good one, they're an unbelievable resource and asset.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. So David and Erin, you have extraordinary backgrounds. It's just such a treat to be a part of this conversation today. You have a wealth of experience, a wealth of leadership experience. You both have worked at the school, at the building level, as well as, you know, played central office roles. I'm just really curious because I think a big focus of our conversation today is on research and the importance of research. Can you talk a little bit about why it is important to consider research when you're selecting curriculum or also creating those systems and structures that we put in place related to literacy? What are your thoughts about this?
Sure. Dr. Brobeck, you mind if
No,
I
I'm gonna
jump in
let
on
you
this
go
one
first because I know Youngstown City Schools has done some pretty amazing things around the word of curriculum. And I'll follow up with some personal insights, but I think what you've done needs first billing.
Appreciate it, sir. I appreciate it. Well, so first and foremost, I will go on record as saying this is my first year working as a central office administrator. Previous to this point, for about, since 2008, I've been a building level principal in some way, shape, or form. So I speak from the facet of sitting in the principal's chair, but now also transitioning into that central office role. One of the biggest things that I think has to go on why are we using research and evidence-based practices in the urban districts I've worked in any district, when we purchase curriculum, when we purchase our teaching and learning materials, they are quite possibly one of the next biggest expense outside of our staffing and our folks. And with that being said, if you are choosing instructional materials that don't provide services based upon good sound evidence, we can go back to the National Reading Panel in 2000, their report. If you're not buying high quality materials, then you might at the beginning already be limiting the amount of success that your scholars are able to attain. And when I'm spending, or when we as a district are possibly spending millions of dollars every single year, that is a significant impact and has unbelievable implications for the next 5 to 10 years of any scholar's learning experiences, because usually most districts have curriculum cycles. We'll reinvest in or update or upgrade our reading curriculum every 5 or 6 years. That means whatever you buy, you are married to for 5 or 6 years, unless you want to be the embarrassed leader of a building that says, listen, we bought something that has all of our data going down the tubes. And there are plenty of districts that can attest to that. But the nature of it is, from my standpoint, it always was, I wanted to be fiscally responsible to make sure that every investment we made met the needs of our scholars and ensured that they had success. Because if we invested in the wrong program and didn't get the right buy-in over the next couple of years, our data tanked, morale tanked, because everyone's not getting the growth, or they're not seeing the efforts of all their hard work. So from a financial standpoint, it was seriously challenging for us, and it's something we consider even still to the day. Like Dr. Brobeck shared, as a district now, we have curriculum cycles now. So as we're in the midst of our curriculum terms and tenures, we're evaluating the impact of what we're doing. And then we're continually looking at the research and the evidence, using ed reports and cross-categorizing what do the ed reports say for our urban scholar population, and is it really hitting the need? So between evidence, between research, between the finance, all these things have a very, very significant impact. The other one is at the building level. So once I get a curriculum, I'm also worried about who is getting it, and is it meeting their needs? So are we getting everybody the exact same program or curriculum? Do my significantly cognitively impaired scholars have the same learning needs as our ESL scholars? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the one thing we want to do is to make sure that when we choose our instructional materials, that we grow our capacity as educators, which is part of the guidebook, growing our capacity, so that we can put scaffolds, we can put access points for any of our scholars. Take an example. So I just said, sometimes we have to get different learning materials for scholars with different needs. But what we have to realize is we still have to start with a good, solid core tier 1 for everyone. And when we start with solid core tier 1, then we provide access points. Because if I have little Aaron in the room who struggles with middle phonemes, well, guess what? I need to make sure that I'm doing that. A specific example, I was a pre-K through 8 principal, and we identified through some diagnostic assessments, which again is consistent with the guidebook. We looked at every 5th through 8th grader in our building to evaluate why were they not moving forward, why were they not performing. Come to find out, every single one of them struggled on long and short vowels. So in your 5th through 8th grade, you're using multisyllabic words. You're trying to interpret them in text, in content, in a science post, in a math question. And our scholars were not consistently strong with short and long vowels. So we had to go back as a building and reteach that. And I'll say that leans back towards our conversation about the concept of MTSS in the guidebook. What that's speaking to is to making sure at any point in time, we can have anyone in the building identify what every scholar needs, what the intervention that's being provided, and what are we doing to track, monitor, ensure that that is taking place. I please find me a parent that would not be extremely ecstatic if a teacher could tell them exactly what their child needed, what they were doing to address it, and then be able to communicate progress on that. I think that in the realm of just any general scholar, and I have some information that I'll actually share later on, which speaks to my own experience with that with my own children. So the MTSS process as part of the guidebook just says we know where all our scholars are at any moment in time. We're providing high leverage practices that really move them. We're not just pulling something out of the hat. We're not pulling something out of the air, or what do they call it? The Oprah effect. Everybody gets a car. We're not giving everyone a car. We're giving David what he needs, Aaron what he needs, Sarah what she needs, to make sure that by the end of our education experiences, excuse me, we're all prepared for success in life. In the grand scheme of things, so going back to the guidebook again, as a practitioner, it's just an instruction manual. It tells me, here's some general practices you can follow. And the most important thing is starting and identifying really early. Because in kindergarten, if I identify a scholar that needs some services, they're missing some particular skill set. Again, the evidence says that I can intervene in 20 minutes a day on that specific skill. And then that scholar can get back to being proficient on that tier 1 level of expectation. So 20 minutes in kindergarten. Another ballpark figure we used was about 30 minutes in first grade. When I get to second grade, I'm looking at 45 minutes to an hour. Third grade and beyond, I'm almost at 2 hours a day trying to just provide interventions. So if we're using the concept in there as a building level administrator and a person now that supports building level, administrators and teachers, I can save myself $86,000 in a middle school per year for a title teacher that's going to be providing interventions with 5th through 8th graders with 20 minutes of intervention in kindergarten, and then keeping that consistent. Because once I start that intervention, a scholar demonstrates need, I can't just drop it. I can't think, oh, they hit the benchmark, they're good, let them roll. Oh no, we have to continue to keep those supports in place as time goes on. So it's 20 minutes by a classroom teacher, possibly working in a small group during, after they've done that tier 1 lesson, versus $80,000 a year times the number of scholars that need those supports in middle school, because we know middle schools, that is high accountability, high assessment, high stakes testing is full bore. So again, I just hopefully what I was able to share kind of connects the fact that from a building level and a district level, how does the guidebook and the research and evidence in there help us dictate and drive our practices?
Thanks so much. That's so helpful. I mean, I think it's really important for people to understand that when students do not access early intervention and get evidence-based support, that they take more time and energy to treat. As you've talked about, there are also huge financial implications. So thank you so much for sharing that. I do want to move. Oh, go ahead, David.
Go ahead. I'm just going to quickly say that along those lines, it's what we learned about my grandson. He entered 3rd grade. The district used a series incompatible with structured literacy. He was to move into leveled text. The research says that could actually cause a regression for him. So his IEP says they can't use them. That's just a small thing of what we can do when we know more. So please, your next question.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, do children really learn to read in different ways? So we've heard this claim cited at this State Board of Education meetings, often just around the context of discussion around the best practices, language in the guidebook. What does research tell us about this claim? Do children really learn to read in different ways?
As recently as February 11th of this year, neuroscientist Stanislaus DeHaye stated at the Plain Talk About Literacy conference, again, among neuroscientists, there are no reading wars. We know exactly how the brain learns to read, explicitly, systematically using code-based instruction, which is what our guidebook is calling structured literacy. So what confuses people is are there different ways to teach structured literacy? Yes. There is no one program. The guidebook does not recommend one program. A previous testimony was that everybody was going to have to adopt something called Orton-Gillingham. That's not accurate. Orton-Gillingham is one option that some districts may use. But the key is, from the guidebook, there are elements of structured literacy that a district can develop their own. They don't have to buy a program. They can have expertise inside the district. There are different ways to approach this that will address, does the brain learn to read the same way in all human beings? Left hemisphere, yes, that's what the neuroscientists say. It's not anecdotal. That's based on these different types of tests. For example, when I was in college, If somebody was injured, they used x-rays. They didn't have MRI machines. They didn't have these type of imaging machines that we have today that can pinpoint nerve endings in the human body. Neuroscientists can put devices on our heads with electrodes and know exactly what the brain is doing at all times. It's allowed them to treat brain injury more effectively. I believe in the science. I'm not here to say it doesn't work. I know that Mr. Bouie was an athlete. We know there are certain things in training athletes based on the science. When I was in high school, they told us not to drink water. It made us weak. By the time I got out of college, we were supposed to give them as much water as possible because it makes you strong. Somebody discovered that denying water could cause death, and they made the change. In my view, if we aren't teaching children, giving all children a chance to read, we're setting somebody up for a lifetime of challenge and misery that doesn't need to be there. If all these other methods worked, then why aren't our reading scores better in the state of Ohio? Why is Columbus City training 300 teachers in a structured literacy process right now based on the science of reading? It's because they want those kids to read just like we do. And I don't think we can take a step back anymore. This isn't a reading war. This is a war about making sure that every child, whether you're rural or urban, black, white, brown, indifferent, special needs, not special needs, has access to literacy, because literacy opens up a key. I know I'm getting on a soapbox right now. That wasn't your question.
Well, before you slip off your soapbox, also understand too, I mean, I've heard comments and discussion before where we build prisons based upon the third grade reading rate. So we're investing multi-million dollars in these contained correctional facilities, but at the same time, we potentially have solutions that can cure that problem or challenge in kindergarten, in preschool.
All right. And I'll talk as a superintendent right now, and I'll talk to superintendents. I believe early identification of all things saves money. And Aaron talked a few minutes ago about the 20 minutes in kindergarten. One of the things I love about the guidebook is we're going to try to screen early. If we look at the history of Upper Arlington, they had to screen the entire district to settle a problem they had because they didn't do what they were supposed to do early on. And kudos to them for taking on the challenge and doing the right thing to stand by their students. But if we do early intervention and identification and get dealing with these things early on, that saves money because it costs more money to fix things. You know, if anybody's ever built a house, if they didn't build it right the first time, it's really expensive to go back and try to fix, repair things that should have been done right the first time. So let's get it right early on.
Thank you. There has been so much attention on this practice of teaching students how to read by applying meaning, structure, and visual cues to leveled, predictable texts. I've heard a claim that some students learn to read this way. Is this true? And is MSV, I know there are many different terms that are being used, but is MSV really a best practice for some students? Is that a practice that teachers should have in their toolkit and be ready to use?
Aaron, what did you guys, were you giving free books away? Is that a true rumor? You were giving some
this week we are.
What kind of books were those the kids could just take away?
They're a part of a series that wasn't really challenging, if we call leveled literacy series. I think we're level libraries, I believe is what, in many places that I've worked, we've been giving away. One
of the things that I did as a middle school administrator and was hired was to untrack our building because all of our reading and language arts program was leveled. And I worked on both extreme ends, the advanced and the remedial. The remedial materials were awful. They weren't interesting. They were easy to read. And the high end, it was incredible literature. What we did was get rid of it. And 2 years later, all kids were getting good literature. So is there evidence? I will say this, the state of Arkansas, not known as at least, and people in Ohio would not think of Arkansas as a leader in national reading. Their legislature outlawed the use of something called the 3 cueing system. I was introduced to me when I was a middle school administrator. I did not I looked at it, and the last thing that I would ever wanted the middle school students to do when they came across a word they didn't know. Remember, I said we did content-area reading then. You get to a science word, you don't know it, don't guess, figure it out before you move on. The same with reading mathematics. And the example I like to use, if you had a story and maybe there was an illustration of somebody bringing something to drink to a person in bed, and the story was because he had passion for her, he hoped she would get better, and or it would get better. And what if the student reads passion as poison? They both begin with a P, they're about the same length, and they end with an N. Does that change the context? As reading instructors at the middle school level, we do teach students how to use context clues, but those context clues are to figure out where the story's going, not to guess at a word. So do I think 3Qing works? Absolutely not. There is no evidence that it works. There's been no research there. There's no scientific evidence. There's no neuroscientist says if somebody guesses a word that somehow their brain figures out what the word is. Now, what about students who read early? I have a granddaughter who was reading in preschool, and she skipped the first half of kindergarten so that she could get started and working on reading with other kids. It's the science behind this is that she still figured out how to decode explicitly and systematically. You know, I have a children's book back here. And this is a challenge to anybody who's a parent. If this is one that's really fun, by the way, it's both for kids and adults. But if you're going to take this book and you were going to help a child read it, wouldn't you start here and have them sound out words and work through it? Well, that's a systematic and explicit way of teaching children how to read. It's not complicated. We all do it. And to call it something else is not accurate. But there is evidence that leveled text, that's why my daughter's IEP for my grandson was no leveled text. He has to have things that are decodable based on scientific-based evidence for him to advance as a reader.
I would add a little something there to what Dr. Brobeck was saying is, you know, the concept of complex text. One of the people that I was exposed to during my professional development course for literacy was Dr. Tim Shanahan. You know, a reading guru in the world. Just get on a look. And the reason he is so interesting is because he doesn't make claims unless it is proven in research, and not just one, not two, but consistently patterns of behavior. He sometimes challenges folks through things that we are doing because if it is not clearly present and evident in the research, he will call it to question or at least speak on it. So I being an upstate New Yorker originally, I appreciate that fact of creating both sides of the spectrum. But one of the biggest things that he constantly speaks to is the nature of we have to teach with complex text. If we're not teaching with complex text, then we're almost lowering the bar. So then we can get into that conversation of, are we using equitable practices? Are we providing everyone an opportunity to succeed in life if we are not giving them challenging text? I day-to-day battle and challenge and push back on leaders and teachers that say, well, my kids can't read this. And I'm in an urban environment with over 60% of our kids who are in critical need of interventions. They can't understand grade level text. So why am I using a grade level text? Why can't I give them a text that they can actually engage with and, you know, read, but build their confidence? And I always push back and I challenge. I said, well, I mean, you can do that if you want to subject that child to, you know, always having to chase the person who's in front of them in line with the ability of never catching them because they never were challenged at the beginning. I always empathize and push with the fact that we have urban scholars across the board. They are more resilient than most of our teachers. Sometimes they could survive the epochs of anything because of their ability to just adapt and modify and change. So if they are that equipped to adapt and modify and change on the street, why are we making it easier for them in the classrooms? If we stick to hard, challenging, complex text, we scaffold, we support them along the way. I'm telling you, 3 months into it, they will have adapted. Young brains are flexible. They will adapt to the challenge. We will feel even more confident and successful as educators. So by the end of it, if we're doing anything less than complex text, we're lowering the expectations for them and closing barriers, because as Shanahan will say, most of our entrance assessments are based on reading comprehension tests. That's all it is. So if I've never engaged in a complex text, how in the world am I going to read a story for the first time and actually be able to answer questions that gives me access to higher learning?
Thank you so much.
Would it be okay if I shared the screen one more time? That'd be all
Sure.
right with you. So I want to, it goes back to something you're asking about, evidence. And I want to pull back up that article from the Reading League Journal. This particular paragraph where I have typed in the word synthetic phonics, which is the synthetic phonics would be defined as starting from small and going large. So you work with the initial sounds and you work to the whole world. But this is, I'm going to read this in case you're having trouble seeing the screen. In particular, explicit and systematic instruction for students with reading difficulties has a robust research evidence base. For example, and it lists the authors here, there are mountains of evidence that reading instruction for students with word level reading difficulties should include systematic instruction in a phonological awareness, grapheme, phoneme, correspondences, decoding, and word reading. Because, and this goes back to the Orton Gillingham, if you're in a district that uses it, is inclusive of explicit and systematic phonics-based instruction. It is plausible that a mean effect size of 0.32 is rooted in the delivery of this kind of instruction that has been shown to work with students with reading difficulties. Again, there is not statistically significant to say that multisensory does this, but there is mountains of evidence that explicit instruction does. So again, I take it back to my own family. If you're interested in how we found out that we shouldn't have him in a leveled literacy program, there's a recent report that explains it better than I do. It's done by Emily Hanford and AMP Reports. It links to a study from the University of Delaware that they actually did take a look at things, interventions for kindergarten, first and second grade, and found that there was regression after that if they didn't have a foundational, systematic, explicit phonics experience going in, or structured literacy.
Thank you. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to our final question. And then after that, we'll start to address some of the questions that participants have been posing. This last question is, does the Dyslexia Guidebook recommend a specific curriculum? And if you could hold for a second, I have another computer open. And what I'd like to do is actually share a question that was posed that connects to this question. The participant question is, it seems that there will be one or just a few acceptable programs that will be approved because they follow the guidebook. Who decides on them? Who's making the money? And how can one scripted curriculum meet the needs of all the different kinds of learners? What is your response to that? First, does the Dyslexia Guidebook recommend a specific curriculum?
No,
No,
it does not.
no,
Okay.
no, it did no mention of any particular curriculum. Again, this is, I would say this is one of the times when we still retain local control and decision-making skills. Because again, what is the beginning of the guidebook? It talks about professional development and training and making sure all educators understand it at a different level. So then we're trying to advocate on behalf of closing the knowledge gap first, because if I know better, I will do better. So no, it's about growing capacity first, but there is no specific mention of curriculum. No, it just says go, let's use this approach and go find what best fits the needs of your scholars, because your approach in Upper Arlington might be different than my approach of what I need in Youngstown City. So there's still, that whole local control, thankfully, in there. Dr. Brook, you had something you want to add?
Well, because I've been around 47 years, I still have paper things. So this is page 11 from the guidebook, and it says structured literacy doesn't refer in bold to a single instructional method or program. It must be explicit, systematic, diagnostic, cumulative, integrated listening, speaking, reading, and writing, emphasizing structures of language that were mentioned in the article that I read to a few minutes ago that was cited by the same person who claimed that this had to be one piece. It's not. There is mountains of evidence that structured literacy, however, and I'm going to go back and say that there's no one program. Pick a program that you think that works for your district. If you're a parent, talk to your district about how are they going to approach this. It's a good law. But as a matter of fact, the teaching committee of the state board voted 5-2 in favor just a few days ago. It goes before the full board, I think, on May 9th to seek approval. And I said this when I testified. Imagine anything we're doing right now politically that gets 96% approval, with all political parties coming together, realizing this is a need for the children in Ohio. Aaron mentioned prison populations. I have a good friend that he and I were professors together at Walsh University, and he now works with a population of some are dropouts, some struggled, some did the GED in the Cleveland area, trying to help them find careers. Almost 100% of them have reading difficulties. It goes hand in hand. Prisons are filled with people who don't functionally read well. So we can address a lot of programs of society. And Aaron, you said something the other day when we were talking about that new piece they're going to build in Columbus, the chip place.
Oh, yeah.
You're more modern than I am. What were you saying about that?
So what I was saying is, more modern, I wouldn't say that. I just like to read about financial things. We'll just say that much. So in the end, it was the big press release that Ohio and Governor DeWine just are working with bringing the largest chip manufacturing in North America to Ohio from Intel. And they're investing over $20 billion. Intel is into building these plants in the state of Ohio and across the state. And financially speaking, yes, we're giving them $2 billion worth of tax break, but for $20 billion worth of business that can fundamentally continue to roll. One of the things that I've heard in the past and read about was before companies that come to states, they evaluate the education of the populace. So what is the average reading level? What is the number of graduate degrees? That's why if you look across our state, you see a lot of our STEM and science-based programs starting to really get a good pump, because they could be pushing out these the future employees of Intel across the state of Ohio. But when we look at the reading rates across the state, if we only have 40% of our scholars coming out of high school reading at an appropriate level, is it realistic to think that those scholars are the ones that can go in and work in the jobs for Intel? Or are we bringing in a $20 billion business so that they can automize the entire process? So the state of Ohio, we will benefit by having all the subcontractors. So we might build the facilities. We got folks that help do the logistics, do HR type stuff. But the fundamental workers will be robots. So do we have the tools in our educational system to equip our students to be able to transition and fill these high-tech jobs? Or are we importing all sorts of employees from around the United States or around the world to work in this high-tech industry? So that was the nature of what I was reflecting on, is when I lead and I do stuff in school buildings, it is about what type of future are we setting our scholars up for? Are we setting them up for customer service jobs? Nothing against them, but do customer service jobs really pay well enough so that our scholars can go have their own families and have a high quality of life moving forward into the future? Or are they going to be worried about stuff? So I think that was one of the big ones that when we were talking about, it interested me. And then, there's three other things that I wanted to mention. Number one, the main guidebook is about building educator capacity. And I will tell you from my standpoint, I received a lot of professional development that I probably shouldn't have been an elementary principal at the beginning, but because of the amount of information that I received in professional development and in specific things, I consider myself pretty knowledgeable now. I know how to interview somebody and get down to the roots of it. I know how to help support teachers and lead literacy work in a building to get really good results. But we got to grow capacity. And that's one of the main things in there. And the other part is supporting educators. So if I learn more, I can help my teachers, because in both of the buildings and both of the districts that I led this work primarily, we were transitioning from an old model to a new model. And it was not an easy transition. We had folks worried about their jobs, worried about their identities, because they self-identified with specific instructional methodologies. And there was lots of triage that we had to do, because people started questioning their own, let's say, value and everything else. We're like, no, you're still a valuable person. We still need you, but I need you to start transitioning, because guess what? I can no longer, in my conscience, accept the fact that I take one person, one adult, to intervene with one child for a certain period of time, when I have 8 other children out of a, no, I'll be honest. So if I have a class of 22, and I have 14 kids who need significant interventions, I can no longer spend $80,000 a year on one teacher to provide 6 sets of intervention throughout an entire school day and touch 6 scholars. I need that one teacher to touch 60 scholars a day. So it's the nature of, from the building leadership standpoint, the more I know, the better I can allocate staffing, allocate resources, the better I can build a master schedule at a building that makes sure that all my interventions aren't at the same time, but I can stagger it and I know how to plug and play. Those are huge, massive, pretty important things that I've learned. And then the last little tidbit I wanted to share is so my own personal challenge with this work. Anybody that works with me or has, one of my common statements is, if it is not good enough for Ava, Camden, Aaron, or Carson, then I'm not good with doing it for any one of my scholars in my buildings. And those 4 names are my 4 children. But my children, we live in a district that is pretty well to do. I pay a lot in taxes. So can you see my screen share of the NWE report? So what I wanted to do is to show a personal experience. So these are my children's, 3 of my 4, their achievement reports on their maps. So in our local district, they use maps. And what I wanted to show and highlight here is, number one, yes, they are my wife and I's children. So they come from our home. We have high literacy in our life and our homes, as my parents and my grandparents did for me. We read a book every single night, no questions asked. And there's lots of things that I don't have to worry about, my kids don't have to worry about. So there is a lot of caveat. But the main point of what I want to show is, when you look at the scores of all of my children, we can go ahead and we know what the last school year was, from 21, winter 21 to fall of 21. We know we were all in the midst of COVID, lots of virtual learning. I know my children are at home virtual learning. In my particular children's school, they do use foundations, so the basic, some of the teaching of phonics, but they also use level literacy across the board. So some of the challenges that I battle with is, if you look at their scores, you will see, when my wife and I send our children to school, their student RIT scores outperforms the district mean and the norm mean for all that took the test. So we're sending you a product that is already up to snuff, ready to roll. And as you look at time and as it goes on, why is it that in the midst of COVID, our children grew? When you look at spring to fall, why do our kids grow? Because we continued to work and read at home. But what I have also done, and my wife, is, during the entire COVID realm, I went back to the science of reading. I went back to the trainings that I received to ensure my my preschooler and kindergartner at the time were receiving instruction in the foundational skills of literacy. And look where they're going. But now let's take it to the next level, which is, when I look at my children's scores, we'll take Aaron in the middle. His projected growth score in spring is 188. In the winter, he was 172. In the fall, he was 174. So he actually went down. And now he's supposed to jump up by that number. My challenge as a personal father is, when I go into schools where my children go, I have to ask the question, what are you going to do to ensure that my child that we sent to you that is already above the grade of, how are they going to hit that 188? And I will tell you with, they're sending home packets of leveled readers. I question and I have to challenge the simple view of reading. Word recognition times language comprehension equals reading comprehension. But if you put a 0 in there, you get a 0. So if we don't have complex text, back to Shanahan, my children are not necessarily getting exposed to complex text, except for when they're at home or we go to the library and get books. Is that the reason why my own children's scores don't grow? I will tell you that specific instruction, when we look at the NTSS umbrella, I know my daughter Camden was ready for fractions at the beginning of the school year. So her MAP scores in math struggled because she didn't get instructions in fractions until the 3rd grade curriculum stated it to take place last month. So now I'm going to look very closely to see in the spring on her MAP scores for math, what happens. And I know for her literature, it was about figurative language. I know she didn't get instruction in figurative language outside of what we did at home. So in the grand scheme of things, when we're looking at this guidebook and we're looking at the concepts within, multi-tiered systems of student support and scholar support is more than just our scholars who are in critical need. This also speaks to enriching our scholars who are on level and taking them to the next level. Gifted and talented is no longer, it shouldn't just be more work. You get to do more homeworks because you're gifted. Oh no, it should be, I intellectually challenge you on a deeper level so that you grow and I'm able as an educator to provide you what you need every day. So I just wanted to share those little tidbits there at the end, my personal story of what I have learned now to be a better advocate for my own child. So many of the folks, I saw some questions about what do I do with my own children and all that. Learn it first. And then as you learn it, hold people accountable to make sure everybody and anyone is taking care of your children or the scholars in your buildings as leaders and then as educators. I hope that helps, Sarah. I hope that clarified.
It's incredibly helpful. And thanks for sharing about your family. We really appreciate it. I am going to move into the Q&A. We have a number of questions. The first one is, my district has just this year adopted a popular level literacy program beginning next year. Our curriculum department is trying to tag on a phonics program for K1. But MSV will still be the focus using leveled books. Will adding a phonics program without practice with decodable readers, is this the way to go? Would anyone like to respond to that?
I don't have enough information personally to answer that.
Can you read it again?
So I think it sounds like what's happening in this particular district is they are, just for K1, they've adopted leveled literacy, a leveled literacy program, but they're trying to add on a phonics program for K1, probably to address the foundational.
It sounds
literacy
similar to your children, Aaron.
Say that one more time. I got my wife.
I said that process
Sorry.
sounds similar to what your children have in their
Yes.
district, where it's foundations, but then.
Correct. So are they asking, is it a conflict of interest? This is what happens when I multitask.
No, it's okay. What are your thoughts about this? I think this happens a lot. I think some people refer to this as a phonics patch. So you are proceeding with parts of your curriculum position students to learn to read by teaching them how to apply MSV to level predictable text. That's happening in areas, but then we're saying for X number of minutes a day, students are going to use a particular purchase program that is maybe
the simplest, I guess the
structured literacy program.
I get what you're saying. The simple answer that I know I have asking because I was in places where we tried to do the exact same thing. Let's do teach use foundations, but then also let's go back to use this as interventions or whatever else. And it goes to the simple view of reading, which is a multiplication equation. If you put a 0 in there, what do you get? Any number times 0 is 0. So what you're going to do is you're going to create gaps, you're going to create holes. So then we have to use research and have really good conversations, and sometimes the courageous and difficult conversations with decision makers and folks to say, are we going to cut our arm off in spite of, cut our fingers off in spite of our arm? Or are we really going to get the returns by the end of this? Or are we just saying we're doing one thing or not? The understanding and learning has to be aligned. So we all must move forward and understand it to do it together. I hope that's clear enough, but if you're piecemeal and stuff, we're going to miss some parts without a doubt.
Thank you. I also think about coherence for students as they move in and out of, their core classroom and intervention programs, and even within the block.
Excuse me, and it's something else and I just heard it the other day in a training that I was in, and you create whiplash for kids. We're going to do this intervention and then we're going to change it all of a sudden. And let's go back to doing this and then let's stop doing it. So we have to be very cautious with that. We need to be smarter as adults because our decision will impact what happens to the scholars in our buildings.
Thank you. Based on your backgrounds as educators, administrators, and researchers, what is your advice on how to approach school districts where instructional material is not aligned with structured literacy? Are we effectively stuck once a curriculum is purchased?
I would not say necessarily, but it begins with the conversations. I mean, you got to know what you're going up against and how to navigate that discussion. If you just think you're going to go in and strong arm somebody, you're going to create a problem. I partially did that at times. I asked really tough questions of my superiors as to why do I have to do this intervention when I need someone to service 60 kids a day and not 6. I mean, you can get yourself into some pretty hot water at that moment in time. So you have to learn professionally with your organization, with people who you are, of how to navigate that conversation. Because if you try to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't understand what you're talking about, it's going to become emotional real quick. It'll become emotional versus, can we talk about this? Can we have, and it's going to be a long-term engagement. And we know with the state, 99% of the time, people only want to change in districts when it's a mandate. But what do mandates do? They take away autonomy. They take away creativity. So navigate that conversation cautiously and generously, and they'll evaluate all your prospects before you dig into it.
I think it's, we know that there are parents groups around the state that have, Ohio Kids is one of them, that can go in and advocate. I think it's asking good questions. I agree with Aaron. I believe that school districts want to do what's best for their children. And, one of the things that we know that there are certain reading series that dominate the market. Maybe they're better at advertising, but it's finding out what works and what works for whom. For example, the Ohio Dean's Compact for IHEs will provide model lessons. There are places there are resources that a higher ed institution can use.
Is he freezing or is that just me?
He's frozen. I think what we'll do is
if we network.
David, I don't know if you can hear us. You're breaking up a bit. I'm going to go ahead and move on to another question, and then we can circle back to that.
Yeah, I got an unstable internet message if you can hear me, so I turned my camera off. Yes, okay. That is David as a kindergartner, 4th grade elementary school, Monaca, Pennsylvania.
Oh my gosh. Oh, well, David, is there anything else you wanted to say, or is it okay to move on to the next question?
Move on, please.
Okay, this is a great question. You focus on structured literacy, primarily aimed at word decoding. Where does instruction and reading fluency fit into this model? There is a wide body of research that suggests that students who struggle in reading exhibit difficulties in fluency, yet it seems to be missing in these conversations.
I can take a stab at that. First of all, I think if at least in my study of the science of reading and it's been about 5 years now, that if we can first teach the students how to decode automatically with automaticity, and then they can begin to obtain fluency, there isn't a separation within this world of doing this. Structured literacy includes all layers of language: orthography, phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, to build regions of the brain. I was pretty excited when we got to chapters of study related to complex and compound sentences, because that's the stuff I taught as a middle school language arts teacher. But without activating and growing our neural networks, fluency won't happen. And I discovered this working with kids at the middle school. And in Kent at the time, they called it level 4 reading. And these were the kids who were below grade level. And they all struggled with fluency. So yeah, fluency is critical. And we want to link and bridge from decoding to comprehension, but it's often a symptom that there's something else going on ahead of that. And in this case, as I look back on the middle school students, there was a difficulty with decoding. I just didn't know how to treat it at the time. I didn't know what to do about it. So, if we go back to the neuroscience and we take a look at what says with the brain, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we do things that are systematic, explicit. We know how the brain waves work. Because if we go to an inappropriate program, as my daughter discovered for my grandson, it can cause a regression. And the question would be, so he's dyslexic, how is he fluently? He's an amazing reader and can read fluently, but that's part of the practice we do with him. So again, well-trained teachers who understand this don't have a difficulty with it. It's all hand in hand, and there is no separation between the science of reading and fluency, to my knowledge.
Thanks. Okay, this one is specifically for Aaron. How does one engage a middle school student in complex text if they can barely read CVC words?
Scaffold. We scaffold. So, and this is a conversation I've had in every one of my districts. Teachers say, how are we going to do this when our kids can't read? And then we get back to the concept of something that I was a part of just the other day. We were doing professional development in the realm of comprehension. And so tier 1 instruction is, I'm going to teach you and we're going to have a conversation about the concept. So we're going to engage in the text, and I'm going to read the text. I'm going to make sure you understand what the bits and pieces are, because just because I can't read it yet doesn't mean that I cannot understand the concepts behind it and then learn to apply it. And yes, we know all of our tests are reading assessment tests. Well, guess what? Rome wasn't conquered in a night. So then we have to make sure whatever that scholars, if they're on CVC words, then that better be what their interventions are and focused in. And then once we teach them to learn about the big picture of the concepts, then we can backtrack and try to close down those reading gaps. But no, we're not going to win that battle overnight. There's no magic pill, because if there was a magic pill, I'm sure anybody on this call would have already packaged it, sold it, and not be standing here talking today. You'd own your own island in the middle of the Caribbean.
Thank you. So I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I don't believe we'll get to every single question, but I'd like to address a couple more. This is actually directed at David. Can you tell a little bit more about your grandchild's IEP and it's specifying to not use leveled predictable readers? Is there anything you can share about that?
So what came about was we were adamant that we would have him on an IEP before he started kindergarten, and that helps. And my daughter did a lot of background work in reading in this. We actually did consult with a special needs attorney to make sure that we knew what our rights were. And I'll say it because we're privileged to be able to do that. I don't want to say that that's available to everyone, particularly when they live in Appalachia and it's denied. But what happened was, because of the intervention work and tier 1 and tier 2 that they did for him with that structured literacy program in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, he emerged as one of the top readers in his grade. He's very bright. He has the ability to memorize lots of words, but even new things he would, if he could skip having to do the breakdown, he would. They wanted to drop his IEP. Said, we don't need an IEP for him anymore. So she's a very well-researched individual, and she looked into it. She talked to some cognitive psychologists who said, absolutely not. You do not want to do that. Here's what you have to find out. And you need to ask questions. Are they using level text? Are they using decodable readers? Do they have a program consistent? And the district is going to actually adopt a new program next year that aligns more closely with the science of reading. But there's this year, because of funding, and Aaron has addressed this, they were going to stick with the same one. So it was written into the IEP. And if you're not sure about IEP law and why you want your child on an IEP, it's law. When I taught school law, I would have somebody say, well, what about the rights of the kids that aren't on IEPs? I said, they have a right to free, appropriate public education, but the IEP still trumps. That's law. So when you get into the IEP, they have to do it. And we kept him on the IEP. Also discovered that there were some dyscalculia issues with his dyslexia in mathematics, and that was put into the IEP as well.
Thank you. We have a question from a parent, and I'll just summarize it. The student was diagnosed through an outside evaluation in 2014, is now a secondary student, and has not had access to structured literacy. Do you have any advice or tips for parents who have secondary students who are still not reading at grade level? Any tips about what to ask, questions to ask, how to approach this?
I'm going to do this with an analogy. Let's say that we came across an adult who couldn't read. They grew up somewhere, they did farming, they lived in the mountains, come back and they're 30 years old and cannot read. What would we do to teach that adult to read? We would start to teach them how to decode words, because their brain is going to learn the exact same way as they would have if they'd been taught to read in first grade. So what I would suggest is that if I was the superintendent and you came to me and we knew that your child is a 9th or 10th grader, can't read well, we're going to start looking for the structures we have to put in place. And Aaron's described some of them. These are going to be these interventions to teach them how to break down and decode words. If they can't do that, then they won't reach that level of being able to be successful. I saw this happen with a student back in the day. They called it DH, developmentally handicapped, in Kent. He was reading below a second grade level in the 10th grade in a special ed class. They brought a reading specialist in to help him learn to decode words, and he could functionally read around 5th or 6th grade by the time he graduated from high school. Today, he has a very successful job. He works in Columbus. It's a manual labor job. He's a great young man, but sometimes people thought because of his IEP, he could never learn. Fortunately, in the Kent City schools, we had leadership, and my mentor and the person I modeled my superintendency after, Dr. Donald Lytle, made sure that things like that got taken care of.
Thank you. Well, I think we are going to wrap up now. David and Aaron, do you have any closing comments for participants on the topic?
And I would say, just as if you are a leader, or if you are an educator, if you're a parent, the more you know, the better equipped you are to be able to speak credibly and challenge. And there was always let's say a friend or an ally to reach out to and ask for further clarification, further guidance, and or support. So definitely continue to grow what you know, but then also reach out, and don't be afraid to ask those difficult yet uncomfortable questions with anyone and everyone, whether it's advocating for a scholar, supporting for your own family, or asking, just explain the why behind the how type of scenario. And don't ever, the other part is, I would say, don't sell students' dreams short, because if we don't give them what they need now, we're preventing them from being successful later on down in life. And lastly, hi, Mom. I think my mom jumped in on here at one point in time.
And blessings for that. I have family here, but not my mom. My mother was a teacher, by the way. I would say that if you want answers and if we haven't been able to provide them directly, ask. Contact the Central Ohio IDA. I can be reached. I'm happy to direct. I mean, I I'm very proud of my association, my years at Walsh University. It's a science of reading institution. We modeled ourselves after Mount St. Joseph. We have regional leaders from some institutions around the state, Youngstown State, Bowling Green, Findlay, all have people who are active in this work. And if you're near one of those universities, Marietta College is doing some amazing things. Reach out. There's somebody there that can help. And I would say to parents, look at the neuroscience and the cognitive psychology. Tim Shanahan, David Kilpatrick, or Stanislaus Dehaene, or some that come to off the top of my head, is that's what I did. I went outside my world of comfort. And I think it's made a big difference for me, and it's made a difference for my family.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation so much. It's fascinating. I've learned a lot. I did want to mention that this is co-hosted by OH Kid as well as IDA of Central Ohio. And I just wanted to mention that there are 2 board members from the Ohio IDA branches that are on the Ohio Dyslexia Committee, Rebecca Tolson from Nobida, and also Mike McGovern from IDA of Central Ohio. So if you'd like to follow those organizations on social media, I know they're both active on Twitter, for example.
I learned from
encourage you
Dr.
to
Tolson. I learned a lot from Dr. Tolson. She was one of my PD folks back in the day.
Yay. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. Aaron and David, once again, thank you. We appreciate all the work that you do and your willingness to have this conversation today. And we will, as I mentioned, we have recorded this and we will share it on social media, and we'll send a copy to all participants. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining.